This would be an appropriate time for someone's cell phone to go off. We had an incident at one point where we had one go off at a communion table. It was honky-tonk, badonka-donk. Thanks be to God and amen. The second scripture reading for this morning comes to us from the 12th chapter of the book of Genesis, the first 9 verses. If you are interested in reading along in the Pew Bibles, that can be found on page 9. Now the Lord said to Abram, "Go from your country and your kindred and your father's house to the land that I will show you. I will make of you a great nation, and I will bless you and make your name great, so that you will be a blessing. I will bless those who bless you, and the one who curses you I will curse. And in you all the families of the earth shall be blessed." So Abram went, as the Lord had told him, and Lot went with him. Abram was 75 years old when he departed from Haran. Abram took his wife Sarai and his brother's son Lot and all the possessions they had gathered and the persons whom they had acquired in Haran. And they set forth to go to the land of Canaan. When they had come to the land of Canaan, Abram passed through the land to the place at Shechem, to the oak of Moreh. At that time, the Canaanites were in the land. Then the Lord appeared to Abram and said, "To your offspring I will give this land." So he built there an altar to the Lord who had appeared to him. From there he moved on to the hill country on the east of Bethel and pitched his tent, with Bethel on the west and Ai on the east. And there he built an altar to the Lord and invoked the name of the Lord. And Abram journeyed on by stages toward the Negeb. May God's blessing rest upon the experiences of Scripture on this day, upon the meditations of our hearts, and the words of my lips. It's fun to pull out that old technology. Stuff is almost bulletproof. When we moved into the house where we're at, one of my first goals was to get us a good old-fashioned copper landline put in. I found a unicorn. I found a heffalump. I found a balanced budget, but I could not find a copper landline to get put in. It's an animal that just doesn't exist anymore. So we have another phone. It's set up as voice over IP, as all the technology is going to at this point. But I wanted that landline because when we lived in North Carolina and storms would happen, power would get knocked out, I could still receive a call. I could still call out to the world if need be. Now, I tried training our chickens to carry notes. It just didn't work the way I wanted it to. They sort of stood there and stared at you with this paper tied to their legs, and then just, they don't fly very well, chickens and turkeys, so it seems. But all of this is to think about what it is to make and receive calls, because that's where Abram is at. That's where the Genesis story is at. The first, 9 of the first 11 chapters, if we set aside the initial creation story, pretty much from the garden through Noah, is a story of God interacting with the world where people misbehave and God attempts to correct our misbehavior in some way, shape, or form. Now, this has led to some rather, in my opinion, unfortunate interpretations of Scripture, one of which being that storms are sent as punishment. And so when a storm rolls through, we start trying to go through the list of who's been misbehaving and how they've been misbehaving. I think our better, healthier reaction is, how is God working in the rebuilding, and how are we called to be part of that? And that idea of call is more what God's doing in this Abram story. Because this transition is taking place in this 12th chapter. The arc of Genesis is shifting away from people behaving badly and God punishing. It's still going to be there. It's a scriptural thing. It seems that humans are humans all throughout history. But this is a change. This moment of call is a shift that the authors of the text, the people recording the story, feel it's important for us to receive, that we might understand what God is doing. Because in this moment, God is shifting away from reacting to the misbehavior of people to being proactive in reconciliation. God has called Abram. Now, this isn't the first time that God has spoken to Abram. We get the sense that God has already taken Abram from his original home, the city of Ur, a very lovely city, by the way, and taken Abram's family to Haran, which is another very lovely city, by the way. But now God calls. Now, up to this point in Scripture, if God is calling, you probably don't want to answer. You've got caller ID, and it says God on it. Before this point, you really don't want to answer. Because before this point, when God calls, it's to ask Adam and Eve, where are you at? What have you done? Or to ask Cain, where's your brother? What have you done? Or to talk to Noah, saying, Noah, there's going to be a floody. So taking that phone call could be a rather dreaded sort of thing. To respond, to be listening to what God is doing, it could cause a great deal of anxiety. And as Soren Kierkegaard pointed out, anxiety can lead us to sin because we try to control things that are not ours to control. But this call is a change. As I mentioned to the kids, as far as we know, Abram did nothing in preparation. He received no Sunday school education. No one handed him a Bible and said, here, have at it. No well-meaning clergy member or in-law came up to him and said, Abram, I think God has something special in plan for you. What we know is that God called Abram. Abram, it's time to get up and go. Gather your things. And these were a lot of things that Abram had. He was the head of a large household. This was no small task to get up and shift from the rather lovely city of Haran to rather lovely rural Canaan. This was no small thing. Abram, this is God. It's time to go. Now, I wonder in that call, in that moment, if it was kind of like the way we have experienced other parts of our lives. Hurry up and wait. Abram, it's time for you to pack your things to go. And several months passed. And then finally the orders come through. It's time for you to go. You're going to Canaan. And then Abram gets to Canaan, and well, actually, you're going to Bethel. And then he gets to Bethel, and the orders come through. Well, you need to keep going on to Negeb. I wonder if it was like that. I don't know. Scripture doesn't say, so I can imagine whatever I want. And since I have the microphone and a propensity for thinking out loud, but the call came. And I've been thinking about it and talking about it much in the sense of a literal phone call, or we can think about it in the modern sense where it was emails aren't even modern anymore. An email is sort of arcane technology. pretty soon we're just going to have the thoughts directly wired into our heads. But a text, a Snapchat. I haven't seen the show God Friended Me yet. I don't know if that's going to be what it was like or not, but I've been thinking about those sorts of things, but I think there's something else for us in this call language that we're employing here. It's this language of vocation. It's not a call just in the sense of a literal conversation, be it carrier chicken or smoke signals or letters or copper wire phone or voice over IP, whatever it may be. It's also a sense of call in that Abram received a feeling. Now, I'm assuming he received a feeling because he responded. A stirring in the soul, that nagging, that there's something I should be doing. There's something I should be doing. I was up here yesterday, taking down some tarps that were up and things along those lines. I was wandering around the office. I actually texted home a couple times. I know there's something else I should be doing. I couldn't think what it was. But that nagging feeling that there is a vocation, a career, a calling. So when God calls Abram, we get a literal God speaking to Abram in the text, but we also get the sense that there is this feeling, this stirring within Abram himself. Not something that he necessarily prepped for, went to school for, or spent time thinking about beforehand, but it was there and it dragged him and he went. He was called. A mission, a ministry, something along those lines. And something else in that for us. When Abram is called, there's a promise. There is a promise. But it's not in response to anything that Abram has already done. It's not in response to any gift that Abram has shown or given to God. Now, the tradition that we draw from has read back in and said, well, maybe Abram was the first monotheist, and so God was responding to Abram's faithfulness. We have stories later in Scripture of Abram's faithfulness and his righteousness. But in this moment, all we have is Abram was called. So we can't say for certain what was there that God was calling. But what we do know is that Abram responded, and that what God promised to do through Abram was bless the world. That's a shift. That's a shift in the book of Genesis. Before this moment, like I was saying, it's been God reacting to our misbehavior, and now it is God reaching out and saying, we need to be reconciled, world and God. We need to have a peace that passes understanding between us. I, as God, am going to work through this instrument as a blessing to the world. Now, we might wonder out loud how much good one individual can do, or one congregation. After all, one congregation can only do so much, surely, but we understand the power of covenant bonds and the way that God magnifies what happens. And what we should remember in the Abram story is that it is Abram's great-grandson who leads Egypt in the storing of grain that feeds not only Egypt but the surrounding nations in the Great Famine. And one of those surrounding nations in the Great Famine comes from a family that moves from Canaan land into Egypt. Another story of reconciliation there. And that family becomes the people Israel. And we know that through the people Israel, God sets up a light to the world, and part of that understanding for us as a people post-resurrection is that Jesus, the Christ, the Son of the living God, comes from that. God promises Abram, you will be a blessing to the world. Through Abram, God is going to do great things. That is vocation. That is a calling. Whether it is for a lifetime or whether it is for a season, it is a calling, and Abram receives it. And what's interesting in the Abram and Sarah story, Abraham and Sarah story, as they would become called, is that they have done just about everything you can think of to muck it up. They tried so hard to control things that were out of their control in their anxiety to fulfill either the promises that God has made or to make sure that they were safe when they felt threatened. And God continually worked through Abraham and Sarah as well to fulfill the promises that God has made. That's the nature of the call. When we are given that gift, that calling, that drag into a vocation, and I say drag because there's a great cartoon. It's the footprints in the sand, that poem. There's a cartoon. It's a line sketch of Jesus, arm around persons. It's where you see the two sets of prints. That's where we walked side by side. And when you see that one set of prints, that's where I carried you. And when you see those parallel lines, that's where I dragged you, kicking and screaming. Because we are called. We are called. We have been given vocation. We have that feeling within us. It's not necessarily just professional clergy. We often use that term for professional clergy, that it's a vocation. But anything we are called to that is an extension of God's work in our lives is a vocation. It is a calling. Abram is called to go to a land. Some of us are called as elders. Some of us are called to lead Sunday school classes. Some of us are called to missions work, or we're going out for disaster relief or for community development. Some of us find ourselves engaged in ministry in what would be considered a quote-unquote secular career, because God is working through. That's the nature of the call. That's why we have come into this space, because we are responding to the call. Abram is called and he goes. He goes. And in his path, he worships and he gives thanks. And in the moments where he isn't mucking it up, he witnesses God's greatness in his life. And in the moments after he mucks it up, he witnesses God's greatness at work in his life. Because that is the nature of the call. A call that we have all received. A call to be church today. Thanks be to God, and amen.